Hello, everybody. I'm Marjorie Ornston, and I represent the board of the Photographic Arts Council Los Angeles, or PAC LA. I welcome you today from Los Angeles, and we're so excited to present Jess Dugan, who's in St. Louis, Missouri, who will be sharing many of their most exciting works with us today. So welcome, Jess, from PAC and all our members. The chat feature below is open to everyone to share your thoughts and ideas throughout this talk today. And please use the Q&A column to pose your questions. Jess will be speaking today for approximately 45 minutes, and then we'll shift to questions and conversations. A word about PAC LA. We're an organization committed to educating and empowering communities through an evolving conversation about photography and photo-based arts, the primary visual language of our time. We're very passionate about creating learning opportunities through unique collaborative programming that engages and unifies without exclusion. Now to Jess. Jess Dugan received their MFA in photography from Columbia College Chicago, their Master of Liberal Arts in Museum Studies from Harvard University, and their BFA in photography from the Mass College of Art and Design. I first saw Jess present their work through the Photo LA Fair and was just knocked out right away. And we've all seen many groups of portraits, but there was something about the strength and the look of these works that stayed with me. I find that Jess's subjects' stares penetrate beyond the moment, even creating their own timeless moment, a frozen moment, a sense that this individual could be anywhere and this could be any moment, now or any time in the future. Jess's subjects are comfortable in their skin, in the life they're living without hesitation. I also found the images, beyond their common theme, to consistently carry the same weight, an intimate look, often with humor, sometimes rather serious, but they maintain a super strong tone. Even in a moment of private repose, Jess never takes their foot off the gas. Identity is a fluid concept. Our personal beliefs and our values change as we change. But I see that there is safety in sitting for Jess. Your identity is not only revealed, it is affirmed. The moment is fixed, and along with that, your story. Is there another medium that does this as well as photography? Jess's series of images with their mother and family members are a celebration of identity, how bonding through love and connection lifts oneself. The strength of one's identity seemed to grow through the years in this series. You can feel it. To survive on this shore, Jess's masterwork to date is a wide-ranging examination of transgender and gender non-conforming older adults. Not surprisingly, the power of the photos almost overtakes the energy coming from the immense and palpable power coming from each of these lives lived. To be with these people through Jess's imaging is like being asked in. Come over here and see what this feels like. But it's a gentle nudge and a warm and welcoming one. This is a tough subject for some, but Jess makes it a wonderful environment to hang around in. I was so happy when Jess said they would come and join us for this talk, and I'm so pleased to have them share these truly unique and special stories and photographs. Jess?
Thank you, Marjorie. That was such a beautiful introduction. I'm sitting here trying not to get emotional about your kind words. I so appreciate it. And thank you so much for the invitation to share my work with you and your group. Thank you to all of you for tuning in today and attending. I'm going to share my screen with you here, and we will just make sure that that is all working seamlessly. And then I will jump in. So Marjorie, is that good on your end? Okay, fantastic. So I'm going to share my work with you all today. As Marjorie mentioned, I'm going to go through the trajectory of my work and career over the past 15 years or so. I'm going to start with some early influences and early work, and then share with you 3 main bodies of work, and I will conclude with To Survive on This Shore. So let's jump in. So this is me when I was 8 years old, and I grew up in Little Rock, Arkansas, looking almost exactly the same way I look today as an adult. And from a very early age, it was made clear to me that there was something about my gender and something about my presentation that wasn't what people expected of me. So I grew up with this incredibly heightened awareness around gender and sexuality, and specifically how I fit within the world. And I like to start my talk with this image because so much of my work comes from my own identity in the world, my own experiences, and it's really heavily informed by that. So this snapshot of my childhood is an important touchstone. This is my high school prom photograph. So I moved to Cambridge, Massachusetts with my mom when I was 13, right before high school. And I came out as gay when I was 13. I was very politically active. I did a lot of nonprofit organizing and work, protest work in the streets and things like that. And I was also not at all a school dance kind of person. I was a hang out in the dark room, express myself through my work kind of person, but on a somewhat of a political, not dare, but as a political gesture, I decided to run for prom king. And so I ended up winning prom king, which I hadn't fully thought through. So I ended up going to my prom. And again, I put this picture in here to show you that even as a young person, my identity was always politicized. And I've always chosen to embrace that politicization. And that has affected my life as a person and as an artist. So when I was coming out as a young person, I mentioned I came out as being gay when I was 13. I started questioning my gender and coming out as non-binary when I was 14, 15. At that time, I didn't see a lot of images of people who looked like me in the world around me, in movies and magazines, in mainstream outlets. And so the first place that I discovered representations where I saw myself reflected and that were meaningful to me was in the pages of fine art photography books. So this is obviously work by Catherine Opie. I assume you're all familiar with this work, who was an important early influence for me. Work by Diane Arbus was another early influence. And I discovered books like this, Lauren Cameron's Body Alchemy on the left, one of the first books of portraits of trans men that I had ever seen. And on the right, the Drag King book by Della Grace Volcano with writing by Jack Halberstam. These books were really important to me. And then I also discovered books like this on the left, Reframing's New American Feminist Photographies. And this was an anthology of work by a lot of different artists whose work was socially and politically engaged. And this was incredibly important to me. I learned really early on how validating and important representation could be. And also, it really made it clear that my path would be to make work that had a social and political element. So the book on the right is more recent, if you're familiar with it, but I put this in because if I were coming out as a young person today, I think this book, Art and Queer Culture, would be a similar anthology that I would find and find meaningful. So switching gears just slightly, as Marjorie mentioned, I got my BFA at the Massachusetts College of Art and Design. And when I finished, I got a job working at the Harvard Art Museum. And this was incredibly influential to me. I photographed the collection for many years. My desk was in art storage. I looked at a massive amount of prints, and specifically old master prints. And I was surrounded by these beautiful paintings and old master portrait paintings. And so this aesthetic really seeped into my brain at a young age and has heavily influenced my work as a photographer. So I'm going to show you just a little bit of my early work to give you a sense of how I started. These were some of the earliest portraits that I made. I was 18, 19 years old. I was learning to use a view camera, a 4x5 view camera, which for anyone unfamiliar, it's the kind you put your head under the cloth, and it's a very slow, intentional process. And I wasn't thinking of these as a body of work, but when I look back on them, I see the seeds of everything I'm still interested in this very early work. And for me, that is an interest in portraiture, and specifically in how it relates to identity. I'm very interested in how we read an internal identity, a very complicated internal identity, through something external like clothing, gesture, and pose. So when I was 18, I had chest reconstruction surgery, and My mom had always been very supportive of me. She was there with me throughout this process. And this was the first image I made after having that surgery. This was about 2 weeks after. It was the first time I could physically hold my camera. And I felt that it was really important to document this moment. I've always used my photography to make sense of myself and my place in the world. And that's what I was doing here. This image became important for a couple of reasons. One is that it began a long tradition of self-portraiture and working with my mom, which you'll see as I go throughout the talk. And the other is that it really started my first body of work, which I call transcendence. I was living in Boston. I was part of a very active LGBTQ community and transgender community. And I started photographing my friends and my peers. And again, at the time, I didn't see a lot of images of people within the transgender community or even the queer community more broadly that were humanist and complicated. The images that I was surrounded by were either overly negative or focused on violence or just presented in a very reductive way. And so I felt strongly about making pictures that were complicated and that were human. So I continued working in this project, but I switched to color around 2010. And I also started focusing specifically on people within the transmasculine spectrum. So people who were assigned female at birth and transitioned to some other point on the gender spectrum. And I did this in part because it was the experience I was most familiar with. It was the community I was most directly a part of. And I felt that I could speak the most intimately about this aspect and this portion of the community. And it was also a really important shift for me moving toward looking at masculinity more specifically, which I'll talk about in a later body of work. So for a while with this work, I had really resisted making pictures that showed the physical aspect of transition because I felt that so many representations of people who were trans identified focused only on the body and it was very reductive. But at some point I realized I was leaving out part of this conversation. So I made this picture of a friend of mine, Mick, injecting his testosterone shot. And this image was important for a number of reasons, but one of them for me is that it's really when I start to see a heavy shift in my work to bringing in that painterly influence. I think that's apparent in terms of the color and the light, but it also employs a strategy that I use a lot in my work, which is fusing an incredibly classical style of photography or portrait making with a very contemporary subject. And so that's something that I'll continue to talk about. So in 2011, I had a revision on my own surgery, on my own chest surgery. And this was the picture I made after that. And I've always felt that it's important to share my own story and include myself in my work. It implicates me as part of the community that I'm photographing. It shows that I'm having these same conversations that I'm having, with myself that I'm having with other people. But equally importantly, I found that by sharing my own story, it really makes space for other people to share with me. I ask a lot of the people that I photograph, I ask them to be very present with me and share themselves openly with me. And I've always felt that it's really important for me to do the same. This is an image of Dallas from this project. He's someone I photographed again. And I wanted to show you this shot. This is from the San Diego Museum of Art, and Dallas is there in the corner. And every summer the curators interrupt the permanent collection with contemporary work, and they put my picture of Dallas in this room with Renaissance portrait paintings. And the two women here were called Anonymous Portrait of a Woman. And on the other side of the room, there were two pieces called Anonymous Portrait of a Man. And so I love that they put this picture of Dallas here because it interrupts assumptions around the gender binary, but it also connects my very contemporary photographic practice with a much longer history of portraiture. So in 2011, I moved from Boston to Chicago to go to graduate school. And I had intended to keep working on transcendence. So I immediately found some people to photograph. This is Dallas again. I started making portraits, and I realized very quickly that while I was still interested in identity, my interests had really shifted. I wasn't interested in documenting one particular community or part of one particular community, or even focusing on one specific identity, but I actually became interested in trying to make work about this process that we each go through to understand ourselves and who we are, and then how we connect with other people from that place. So I was trying to picture something that's inherently more difficult to photograph and a bit more ethereal. So this is a picture of me and my partner, Vanessa. This was one of the first pictures we made together. And you'll see that this eventually grew into its own body of work, which I'll share with you, but that was one of the early ones. So in this work, I was thinking a lot about intimacy and desire. I'm thinking a lot about a gentler version of masculinity, which I'll return to. There are some still life images in this project. I think of myself largely as a portrait photographer, but I included some still life images in here because I wanted to talk about this more universal need for connection, need for relationship. And these allow me to do that in a way that is more universal, and that's not about one specific couple, but it really allows me to talk about that on a larger level. So there are some self-portraits in the project. This is a literal self-portrait. And this one in particular is interesting because I'm really projecting myself and my identity out at the viewer. There are different tones in my self-portraits throughout the work. And I was playing with a kind of, beefcake imagery that you see in dating profiles, but also obviously there are art historical references. And I had this piece on view at the National Portrait Gallery in DC, and I gave a talk as part of that exhibition. And someone asked me a question about how it felt to be nude in the museum. And I thought it was a really interesting question because my answer depends on how you read my body. If you read my body as male or masculine, then this is not considered nude. And if you read my body as female or feminine, then this would be considered nude. So I think it brings up this interesting double standard around bodies and nudity and presentation. And so this is obviously a literal self-portrait, but I also think of this project as a whole as a kind of extended self-portrait, because the people that I choose to photograph are people who I'm drawn to on a personal level. They're people that mirror something that I either see in myself or want to see in myself. So the way that I choose subjects for this is incredibly subjective and has a lot to do with who I am. So I was thinking a lot about gesture and what kind of gestures imply intimacy. In this piece in particular, there's obviously a strong reference to painting again and traditional posing, thinking about relationships, thinking about connection. And in all of my work, the way that I photograph is very intentional. I go to people's homes and personal spaces. My camera's always on a tripod. I use natural light. I use slow shutter speed. So there's a lot of collaboration between me and the subjects. And that's an important part of how I create the images that I create. Here's another self-portrait. So in 2015, I published a book of this work that had 62 portraits from 2011 to 2015. And then in part because I worked on To Survive on the Shore, which I'll show you in a few minutes, I paused a little bit on Every Breath We Drew, but I'm now returning to this. And I was photographing for it over the past several years, but I'm now working on this really intensely, and I'm continuing to make work along the same topics. I'm still interested in identity. I'm still very interested in a gentler version of masculinity, thinking about how that can be more expansive than what we are typically shown in the world. But for me, the work is really changing. I'm trying to push it and make it even more dynamic. And part of how I've been doing that is to change the settings in which I've been photographing. A lot of my earlier work was made in indoor spaces in really even light. And in a lot of this newer work, I'm photographing either really early in the morning or really late in the day. This is Colin at sunset. This was the first portrait I made of someone else post the world shutting down in March. We made this in, I believe it was in May. We made it outdoors. So I've started working outdoors again. This is another picture of Colin. So an important part of my practice is also photographing some of the same people over a period of time. And you'll see that more specifically in the family work, but that also comes into play in this project. I find that by working with the same person over a long period of time, I can reference things like growth and change, but I also can make increasingly intimate portraits as we get to know each other and get to trust one another. So in addition to working outside, I've been seeking out different kind of light settings. I've been looking for really intense light. This is a very recent portrait also made during the pandemic of JD and Steve. This was at the very, very last bit of light in the day. And I'm seeking out these situations in part because I love the quality of light at that time of day. I love how ephemeral it feels as things are starting to shift. But also for me as a photographer, technically, anyone who's ever photographed at sunset knows that the light changes incredibly rapidly. So it forces me to react in a way that pushes me to make increasingly complicated photographs. So I was kind of throwing a wrench in my own practice, so to speak, to try to keep pushing it forward. During the pandemic, I've been making a lot of self-portraits. As I mentioned, I've always made self-portraits, but this was one thing I returned to fairly heavily after I was unable to travel and photograph other people in March. So this is a recent self-portrait made in my home. This is Oscar, who's also someone I've photographed quite a bit over the past few years, again, made at the very last bit of light. This is Oscar and Zach, also from earlier this year. So there are some stills in this new work, and you saw a few in the earlier part, the jeans and the pillows. And recently I've been photographing objects again. You saw the candles a minute ago, and I've been photographing flowers. And for me, these still lifes function very similarly to the earlier ones in that they reference a relationship and a need for a relationship. And when I was photographing these tulips, I couldn't help but think of them as two people bent over in a kind of embrace. This is Kai, who I photographed very early in the morning in Provincetown. Another image of Kai from also very early in the morning. I have a few friends who will meet me at 7 a.m. Not all of them will meet me at sunrise. This is Chabez, photographed here in St. Louis. So throughout most of my work, I utilize a direct eye contact with the subject, and I do that for a number of reasons. One is that it allows the subject to present themselves to the viewer in a way that they want to be seen. It gives some power back to them as the subject. But equally importantly for me, it activates the experience for the viewer. It requires that when you look at this photograph and you look at this person, that you can't look at them passively. You have to engage with them and enter into a relationship with them. And part of that then requires you to think about your own identity and your own assumptions about someone else's identity. So I want my pictures to really engage whoever looks at them and make them think critically. So I mentioned that people that I photograph for this project are people that I feel connected to. They're people that I meet somehow throughout my life. And but sometimes people approach me to photograph them. So this is a friend of mine, Jamie, who I had known for many years, and she approached me about making pictures with her because she had had breast cancer. And as you can see in this image, this was the first image we made together. She had had surgery to have one of her breasts removed, but she found that so uncomfortable that she knew she was going to go back and have a second surgery. So she asked me if I would make pictures with her and document her body. So this was the first one we made together. And we've continued to make work together. This was the second shoot that we did. And this was her and her partner in front of her partner's home here in St. Louis. And again, at the very last bit of light in the day. And I just love this gesture. I love how Anne, her partner, is sort of embracing and supporting her from behind. And for me, it really referenced some of that story that I knew she had been through and some of her experiences. And then this is another picture that we made after her surgery. This is Andre, also from earlier this year, right before the world shut down. Another self-portrait that I made at home. And then in addition to the still life images, I've started including some environmental shots. So this is a picture of the early morning light. This is actually my mom's house in Boston that I made earlier this year. And another recent self-portrait. So I put a few installation images in here to give you a sense of how my work exists in physical space. It's really important to me that my portraits are large enough that the viewer can engage with them and have a very meaningful individual exchange with that person. But I don't want my pictures to be so large that they tower over you and they become larger than life. So the scale is incredibly important to me when they exist in a physical space. This was at Indiana University last year. And then this was an exhibition at the Norton Museum of Art in West Palm Beach, Florida from earlier this year. And then this is Erica and Krista, who came to an opening I had in Chicago, not intentionally dressed exactly the same as they were in their diptych. So they humored me and let me take this picture. And I put it in because it's cute and funny, but also because it's very important to me that I involve my subjects in my work after the moment of making their picture. I try to stay in touch with everyone, to let them know where their portraits will be seen, to invite them to openings, to keep that relationship. And that's something that's really important to me, especially because I often work within LGBTQ communities and just feel very strongly that our relationship doesn't end at the moment that I make that picture. This is an image from the Cornell Fine Arts Museum in Florida. And the curator put this portrait of Betsy in a room, as you can see, with paintings and under a heading of gesture and pose, which I really love. I often get placed in photography galleries, which is also fine, but I'm particularly excited when my work gets placed in this longer conversation of portraiture and in broader headings like gesture and pose. And then this is from earlier this year. This is at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. It was in an exhibition called Personal Space, Self-Portraits on Paper. And again, I was really thrilled to be in this show. My work is often exhibited in either photography specific ways or in queer specific shows. And so it was really especially meaningful to me to have this in an exhibition that had a completely different organizing principle. So in 2010, I started making that same picture I had made with my mom. We've begun making this picture every year. And, it's become a really wonderful practice. My motivation for doing this was to document our bodies as we aged and changed, to, document our relationship over time. Like I said, my mom's always been incredibly supportive of me and important to me. I'm also interested in the idea of family and how we come from one place, but then we make decisions that lead us down different paths. But what's happened as we've made this picture is, all of those things are present, but it's also become this annual affirmation of both our relationship and her support of me and my work. So it's something I hope to do for a really long time. I have every intention of continuing the series as long as I can, and really enjoy this sort of annual coming together that we have because of it. My mom moved between 2018 and 2019, so I had to switch walls, but we've readjusted. So in addition to that part of the series, which is kind of its own little focus, I've been making other pictures with my mom over the past 10 years or so. And I never set out to make a body of work about my mom or my family. It happened a bit organically, but it's definitely become a significant part of my practice. And again, it addresses my interest in family and also in relationships in a different way. So this is something that I also intend to continue for a long time. This was made last summer in Provincetown. This is my mom and her partner, Chris. And then this was made this past July. I made a road trip to Boston to visit my mom, and we made some pictures together. And this was a revisiting of that earlier portrait on the bed. And I really loved how this one came together. And then this was also from this past summer, a more recent picture of my mom and Chris. So in 2012, I met my partner, Vanessa, and you saw that earlier picture of her in Every Breath We Drew. And when we started dating, I started photographing her. And I originally thought that this work would be part of Every Breath We Drew because I conceived of that project as being about, identity and gender and sexuality and relationships and intimacy and connection. And so to me, it seemed related, but it quickly became very clear that this had actually branched off into its own project. And I had made, 20 pictures of her, and it very clearly became its own series. And so there are a couple things I love about this work. I mean, one is that it allows me to talk about everything I'm interested in, which again is identity, family, gender, sexuality, relationships, connection, desire. But none of those things are foregrounded. All of those things are present, but through this very subjective portrayal of a relationship. So that's really exciting to me conceptually. And then technically as a photographer, it requires me to make different kinds of pictures. In most of my work, I might photograph someone, 3, 4, 5 times, but I rarely photograph someone, 20, 30, 40, 50 times over a period of 7 or 8 years. So I've enjoyed that technically it requires me to make different kinds of images, to make different decisions, and requires me to keep pushing myself as a photographer, which I find productive and also exciting. So in the family work in particular, the passage of time is a very specific element of this work. It's not only present, but it's incredibly necessary. And so that's something that I see developing over a really long period of time. I've never exhibited this work in a physical space, in part because I imagine this project unfolding over the next 20 years before I really feel like it's complete. I will be showing some of this work in, I think it got pushed to 2022 at the National Portrait Gallery. So I'll start exhibiting it then, but I've kept it kind of close to home because I really want it to become something that's very long term. So my partner and I have a daughter. She's 2.5 now. And when Vanessa got pregnant, I started photographing her as makes sense for my work and my practice. And, in the beginning, I was really thinking of this as just a natural extension of me photographing my life and my family. This was made about 48 hours after Eleanor was born, and probably about 60 hours after we had slept at all. So this was an incredibly intense moment to document in the hospital. And, as I said, I started making this work just because it felt really personal and it felt important. But even though I haven't exhibited it, I've shown it in lectures, and I've shared it with some colleagues and some curators. And it's very quickly become apparent to me that there are not a lot of images of queer family and queer parenting. And so, similar to some of my other work, it comes from this incredibly personal place, but I hope that it also will begin to fill a representational gap, and to offer a kind of imagery that we don't often see, that we haven't often seen around us. And we'll see how this goes as she gets bigger and more autonomous. I actually got a new camera recently, in part because I needed to work a little bit faster. And then this is just a little subset of this work. This is a garage door behind my house, a neighbor's garage door. And I've started making pictures of Vanessa and Eleanor there, and we do it, roughly every 6 to 8 months. And so again, this is a little, mini series within the family work that I anticipate continuing to make over a long period of time. This is the most recent. So the third and final project I'm going to share with you is To Survive on This Shore, photographs and interviews with transgender and gender nonconforming older adults, that Marjorie spoke a bit about in her introduction. So again, I mentioned I met Vanessa in 2012. She is a social worker whose work focuses on LGBT aging. And obviously you've seen what my work was prior. And we realized when we met that we had overlapping interests, and that we could potentially create a project by combining our skill sets that was meaningful. We perceived a lack of representation of transgender and gender expansive older adults, even though we knew that community was large and very significant. And so we joined forces and we started creating this project. We made our first portrait in 2013. We worked on it until 2018. And for each person, we would make their portrait and also conduct an interview. There was about an hour interview about their life that would then get edited and transcribed. So I'm going to begin and end by reading you an interview. I won't read them all in between because we would be here for a long time, but just so you have a sense of the project. So I'm going to read you Chris's interview, and you'll see it also on your screen. So Chris said, "I feel like I was always punished for my masculinity when I was female designated by both straight people and lesbians. I was not the kind of woman that either women or men wanted to be around. I was way too scary and people didn't know what to do with me. I was always a fish out of water in terms of my gender presentation. So in a huge way, my transition has been like nirvana. For it to get all aligned with me and then have the world treat me well while I'm aligned has been amazing. I mean, just really amazing for me. So I lived in that lesbian world, even as it was difficult to do. I actually gave birth to both of our children, which was never inconsistent with my sense of still being a man and being pregnant. And I know that many people can't understand that, or they might have some understanding, but it was not inconsistent for me to be with my male identity and want to have children. Integrating all of our identities as a family has been a journey. So my spouse and former spouse identify as lesbians. My kids identified as part of a lesbian family. So applying to colleges, how do you explain on the FAFSA forms for the federal government that somebody's a biological mother and at the same time they're legally a man? And what's their legal relationship? And how do you explain that I'm legally a man that was never married to my former spouse who was legally their mother because we were a lesbian couple? So there's layer upon layer upon layer of complication when interfacing in the world, even as it was not very much of a blip in terms of my family's experience of me and didn't change a whole lot the way our family life ran, was not really that big of a deal. And yet this interface out in the world became a pretty big deal." So that'll give you a sense of the kind of quote that goes with each portrait. So from the beginning, we were very committed to seeking out a diverse group of people. We limited the project to the United States, but beyond that, we sought as broad of a range as possible. So we sought diversity in terms of age. Our minimum age was 50, our oldest participant was 90. We also sought diversity in terms of race and ethnicity, gender identity and expression, socioeconomic status, geographic location, and life narrative. So we went all over the United States. We went big cities, small towns. We went to every major region because we really wanted the project to be as expansive and diverse as possible. This is one of my favorite images. This is Gloria in Chicago. She's on the cover of the book, and she ran a charm school for young trans women of color where she would teach them how to be a lady. So she's much beloved in Chicago, and actually there was a play written about her life, and there was also a documentary that just came out recently. So most of the people in this project I found specifically for this project. There were a few exceptions, and Hank and Sam were one of those exceptions. So as I mentioned, I grew up in Little Rock, and my mom went to a lesbian Bible study group that Sam taught when I was a kid. And so I would get sort of drugged to these gatherings at Sam's home. And I don't remember much about the content. I mostly remember that they always put out really good snacks and they had really cute dogs. But when I was making this project, I thought of them, and I called them and I said, you know, I don't know how you identify, but I'm working on this project. If you want to participate, let me know. And they said, yes, absolutely. So Vanessa and I drove down and spent the day with them. And I was really struck by a number of things. One is that Hank on the left and I share a very similar internal identity, but our experience in the world was so different because of our generational difference. And they both shared with me that later in life, they had each had a double mastectomy, and they had had cancer and they had had a double mastectomy, and they were really happy about their flat chests. And so at the end of our day together, we ended up kind of comparing chest surgery scars and talking about our experiences. And it was incredibly intimate and moving. And I share that story because, you know, working on this project was so humbling. I showed up at people's homes, often a stranger, and they would share their most intimate life stories with me, their most difficult stories, their most joyful stories. And it really created this incredibly intimate time that we spent together. There are some still lifes in this project too. These are Hank's hats, and the third one in says dysfunctional veteran, leave me alone. This is Sky in Palm Springs, one of my favorite portraits in the book. And this is Sky with his partner, Mike, also in Palm Springs. This is DeSanti in Santa Fe. So we would always travel to each person's home or personal space, and that was really important to the project. I could have very easily gone to a trans conference and set up a seamless backdrop and made 100 portraits over 4 or 5 days, but I felt really strongly about going to people's homes. So that's part of why we worked on it for as long as we did. And we would go to their homes and we would always conduct the interview first. And sometimes people would share things in their interview that informed the portrait. So DeSanti, for example, shared that music was incredibly important to him, and it was one of the things that got him through some very difficult times. And so we both felt that including his guitar in the portrait made a lot of sense for his story. Conducting the interview first was also useful for me in that it allowed me and the participant to get to know one another. It allowed them to become comfortable with me. But it also allowed me to get a sense of kind of how they sat and what kind of gesture they made and how they looked comfortable. So it helped me to get information about making the portrait too. This is Jude in Yuba City, California. Jude is listening today, which is very sweet. Thank you, Jude. Hi, Jude. We mentioned we sought diversity in terms of life narrative, and some people in the project transitioned very early, like Jude, who transitioned in the early 1970s, and other people transitioned later in 2016. Some people didn't transition for a variety of reasons. But one thing that was really amazing is that the project had in it layers. So we had several people tell us that Jude had been very significant to them. He was one of the first out trans men they had ever seen. And so to have people who transitioned, sometimes more than 30 years later, reference someone else who was part of the project was really meaningful and was important to us because we wanted to document that history. So this is Jude holding a picture of himself when he was 32. This is Aiden in Washington State. This is Duchess in LA. This is one of my favorite portraits in the project. This is Bobby. Again, Bobby had a long career in the military, and so her house was full of planes and other paraphernalia, and so we felt that it was important to include that in her portrait. This is Suki in New York. This is David in Massachusetts. One of the things we really tried to do while making this project was to honor the full complexity of everyone's experience. So we wanted to portray the joys and triumphs and talk about the joys and triumphs, but we also wanted to talk about the difficulties. And we tried to strike that balance in both the portraits and in the interview texts. This is Caprice in Chicago. This is one of my favorite pictures as well. And I'm pretty sure she had conceived of this entire picture and setting before I showed up. She had kind of staged the whole thing, which was really wonderful. This is Debbie and Danny in Missouri. Danny had suffered a stroke and had been ignored in the hospital because he was transgender and suffered additional damage while he was lacking medical care. So again, that's an example of one of the more difficult stories we felt that it was really important to include. This is Tony in San Diego. And this is Grace in Boston. I'm going to end by reading you Grace's quote, and then I'll talk for just a few minutes about how we get the project out in the world, how we're putting it to use, and then we can move to questions. So I'm going to read you Grace's quote. Grace says, "I always felt more like girls, like women. Even when I was watching movies or television shows or reading books, the female characters were the ones that I identified with just sort of instinctively. So I knew I was born male, but I certainly was a feminine boy growing up, a genderqueer boy, and was harassed and bullied and got a lot of negative attention because of that. I was assumed to be gay from the earliest get-go as well, even though it wasn't talked about then in the 60s. So I was called all the names associated with that. Sissy, faggot, fairy, all of that. I didn't feel like I was transsexual. I didn't have that profound sense of body dysphoria that lots of transsexuals report, even though there were things that I wanted to change. So the way I understood that and was able to express that in the 80s was maybe what we would now call genderqueer. That term wasn't used then, but I lived in another gender space. I just was living in this third gender space. I didn't see it as on my way to anything. I've been lucky to have people in my life who have been supportive of me in my journey, wherever that would lead me. So it was less about giving me guidance on a specific path and more about people who have said, your identity's evolving and that's a wonderful thing. And we encourage you to explore that and go with that. I still see myself as on a journey. When I received an award a few years ago at a conference, I said, in the 60s, they called me a sissy. In the 70s, they called me a faggot. In the 80s, I was a queen. In the 90s, I was transgender. In the 2000s, I was a woman. And now I'm just Grace. I really love Grace's quote for perhaps obvious reasons. It's so moving and meaningful, but I also really love that she situates a very personal journey within this larger social and political context. And that's something that was really important to this project. We wanted to talk about that. We wanted to capture the activism and the history. So I mentioned I started this in 2013. By 2015, I had made about 30 portraits. We put together a website and we got some really important early press, including a feature in the New York Times. And this really exploded the project. I got emails from people all over the country who wanted to participate or bring us to their town or support us in some way. So, so this was really important with connecting with people. I also found people by connecting with nonprofit organizations. As I would travel, I would reach out to local LGBT groups and ask if they knew anyone who was interested. A lot of it was word of mouth, connecting person to person. I did go to a couple of different conferences and present the work and meet people there. And then we sought out people who were really important to the community, well-known activists as well. So this is one of the first exhibitions of this project. This is at the Museum of Contemporary Photography in Chicago. And it's very important to me that my work and this project in particular are in a museum space. I feel very strongly about that kind of representation. But with this work, there's also a huge community element. So while we had that exhibition up at MOCP, we had a simultaneous exhibition at Chicago's LGBT Center, the Center on Halsted. And this wall was in a kind of waiting room where people would come and wait for either personal appointments or group activities of some kind. And so I really loved the duality of having this work in a museum space and also in a community space. And that's something I've continued. So in 2018, we made a book and I sent a book to everyone in the project. I felt really strongly that I wanted to do that. And a lot of people sent me pictures back of them with the book. I would later learn that a lot of people knew what page they were on, which I thought was especially endearing. So with this project, it was really about the participants and their stories, which for me contrasts with my work, like Every Breath We Drew, which is so much about me. But this was really about the people in the project. And so we wanted to center them and their stories in the programming as well as in the formal project. And so as we were doing book release events, we would invite people from the project to come and share their stories. So this is some of the participants at a bookstore in Chicago called Women and Children First. I had the work up at Expo Chicago, which is a fair that happens in September. And I invited Gloria to come spend the day with me. We had a book signing. And I quickly realized that nobody was interested in me. They were all interested in Gloria, which was sort of lovely. So when the book came out, we had a pretty significant press moment that started with this feature in the New York Times and just kind of went from there. And it was really amazing because it put the project on a very larger, more mainstream platform than it had been on. But it also brought up certain quandaries. I did this Instagram takeover for New Yorker Photo, and 85% of the comments were positive, but there were a handful that were negative or hateful. And I really wrestled with this because I feel so protective of the people that I photograph. I feel such a responsibility for how I put their images into the world. And so I checked in with several people and they basically said, we've heard this before, don't worry about it. But, I care very deeply about the people I photograph and the work that I make. And so there's always this complication of putting it out into the world. So this was the first solo exhibition of this work. This is at a gallery called Projects Plus Gallery in St. Louis. And again, at the opening, we invited as many people as possible who could make it. This is Steph, who is local. This is John, who drove up from where he lives in a very small town in Arkansas and spent the weekend with us. And I view the exhibition not as an ending point, but as the beginning. So for every exhibition I have, we arrange a lot of programming as much as possible to really activate the space. So this was a visit from a social work class at Washington University. We also organized a storytelling night with local LGBT groups for members of the local LGBTQ and transgender community to come and share their own stories in the gallery space. And then that exhibition's traveling. So this is from the Provincetown Art Association and Museum last summer. This is from the University of New Mexico Art Museum last fall. It's going to be at the Photographic Center Northwest this coming spring. And then I can't quite say where yet, but it's going to go to an exciting venue for the second half of next year, which should be public kind of soon. So one other piece of this is, we really wanted this project to be used for education. So I created a limited edition portfolio that has 12 texts and interviews. This was made exclusively available to teaching museums. So this is now in the collection of 10 teaching museums throughout the United States and is being used for class visits and being exhibited. This is from the Tang Teaching Museum at Skidmore College in New York. And then the other piece is that, we wanted this work to also continue to exist outside of museums. So this is a community exhibition that we designed to be really affordable and accessible for non-art venues. So this is at a synagogue here in St. Louis. This is at the Brown School of Social Work at Washington University. It was recently up at the University of Denver, and then this is going to continue traveling to really any venue who's interested in having it. So the very final piece is that in addition to the art side, we want to use this work for education and advocacy. So we're partnering with nonprofit groups to use the work in political campaigns, advocacy campaigns. We're donating the full project to several archives to be preserved for historical study and research. And then Vanessa is also using the de-identified interviews in some scholarly journal articles that will reach primarily social work practitioners. So hopefully that will very directly affect the services that people receive in the field. So with that, I'm gonna pause there. And if you're interested, I have more work on my website. There's also a project website for To Survive on the Shore. And this is my email address. And I'm gonna go ahead and stop sharing my screen here. And I would love to take any and all questions that you have. So thank you all so much.
Yes, that was just fantastic.
Thank you. Okay, there we go. I can see you now. All right.
You're a great speaker and the photographs are just sensational. The new work is sensational, really, really lovely.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you
for sharing that. There was just so much brought up during this pandemic time, and to see groups of people in a gallery and then also to see your family growing. It's very personal, and the way that you're able to use your practice and still treat your family and be so open with that, I think is just monumental. And I think it's important now to do that, and you'll see how you're going to look at the work later, how we're all going to look at the work later.
For sure. Yeah. Thank you.
So life is about the process. We all hear that. And I have to say that you are really embodying that, Jess.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. That's nice to hear.
You are living it. So there's quite a few questions. There's some wonderful comments. I want to tell you one comment before we proceed, that Grace just won a GLAAD award. Did you know that?
Oh, wonderful. Oh, and that's from Diego, who's also in the project. Hi, Diego.
Okay, so the Spirit of Justice Award last weekend. She's an angel. So that's someone chimed in. Yeah, it was Diego who chimed in with that news. Also, people are interested in how you shoot. How long are your portrait sessions usually? How many images do you take per session?
That's a great question. So I usually set aside anywhere from 1 to 2 hours for a portrait session. With To Survive on the Shore, sometimes I would spend a full day with someone because of the nature of the interview and traveling to them. but it's usually about an hour, hour and a half. And I work very slowly. I prefer to go to each person's personal space. I like to look around and see, what the light looks like, what their environment looks like. I often ask people, is there a meaningful area where you'd like to be photographed, and what kind of pose feels comfortable to you. So there's a lot of back and forth between me and the subject. I view the process as very collaborative, but and then ultimately, of course, I'm trying to make a photograph that's, formally resolved, visually compelling. So I'm looking at light and color and gesture and all of these things coming together. Unfortunately, now that I work digitally, I make more exposures than I wish I would. So I spend a lot of time deleting files, much to the horror of other photographers. But yeah, I'll make, anywhere from 100 to 200 exposures. And again, that's expanded because of the technology. It was a little bit different with film, but I always edit down to one. So it's a process of me, I'm not sort of candidly taking pictures. I'm very formally working my way into the picture. And usually I know there's this moment when I just feel that everything has come together, that the frame is perfect, the light is perfect, the expression is perfect. I usually know, like, innately which picture it's going to be before I leave. So it's kind of like I work and work and work and work. And once I feel that, I'm like, okay, we got it. We got this picture. And I'm really after a portrait that transcends the specifics of the moment, that honors the specificity of the person, but that goes beyond that becomes something bigger.
Do you do a lot of retouching on the images at the end? Or you usually nail it with the light?
I do things very similar to what I did and would do in a dark room. I adjust some color and some light levels, but I don't do, I trained, I was going to say for better, for worse, but I think it's for better. I trained for better with people who really taught me to do everything in camera. So even though I shoot digitally, I spent 10 years shooting 4x5 film, and the way that I work has remained the same. So I really, I do all my framing, all my lighting in camera as much as possible. And then the things I do in post-production are again, very similar to what you would do in a dark room.
Yeah. You're getting a lot of compliments on the work, and your humility, your mood, your empathy really shows through in your work.
Thanks. Yeah, again, I can't read the chat and talk, so I'm gonna choose to talk.
There's an interesting question from a student who's working on a project involving mental health and is interesting working with the subjects. How do you work with your subjects to help them be fully open? How do you recommend to capture more sincerity and meaning? How do you get them to open up to you?
That's a great question. So I think there are a couple things that I do, some practical and some kind of emotional or energetic. But one thing is that I like to work alone. I really like to be alone with the person that I'm photographing. I don't show up with a team. I don't bring assistants. And I find that really helps me to connect with them on a personal level. And that's really, really important for making the kind of portraits that I make. I also work really slowly. So I think my process kind of allows people to get comfortable and open up. I think everyone, even if they're really thrilled to be photographed and really excited, it takes people a little while to kind of relax in front of a camera. So spending the time is part of it. I do a lot of directing, which is really in response to the person. It's trying to get them into a pose that feels authentic to them, but also visually strong. And I actually find that helps people feel at ease when you have a sense of what you're going for. And then I think a big part of it is the kind of energy and emotion I bring to the shoot. I have to be calm and everything I do, whether it's technical or energetic, is in pursuit of creating this space in which the person that I'm photographing can really just present themselves to me and be really present. And so, I don't come into the shoot kind of frantic and running around. A lot of it's kind of how I show up. And then I guess the last thing I would say, for a student specifically, is I'm really clear about my intentions with the people that I'm working with. For To Survive on the Shore, they were thoroughly aware of what the project was, what it would entail, how it would be seen. For my other work, like Every Breath We Drew, I'll often say, I'm thinking about, identity, I'm thinking about masculinity, I'm thinking about intimacy. What does that make you think of? And, so there's a lot of sharing of my intentions and thoughts as a photographer. And because of that, I think people feel involved in it, and they know when I leave kind of what we've made together. It's a very, the work that I make really requires the full participation and willingness of the people that I'm photographing. Otherwise it just wouldn't happen. So it really hinges upon this collaborative moment that's also intimate and personal.
Yeah, I find with portraiture, you can tell if it's been a collaborative process or not.
Mm-hmm.
And even with paintings, if the model and the painter were working or had some kind of relationship, you can always feel it. And photography, it is very, very obvious. And in your work, clearly, there's evidence of you in the resulting image, I find. So I want to read you a few questions together, and then you can sort of answer together. Do you still work in 4x5? What new digital camera have you transitioned to? Have you found a way to work that resembles the aesthetic of the past film work? And how much conversations do you have with individuals? You pretty much talked about that, but these are sort of technical questions.
Yeah, so I do not use 4x5 anymore. Like I said, I used it for about 10 years. And right before I left graduate school, I realized that was going to be difficult for me to maintain. And it was becoming expensive. So my reason for moving to digital was a practical one. I worked for 7 years with one particular Hasselblad medium format, and I just a couple months ago got a new one. But I work with medium format digital now, and it actually is very indistinguishable from my 4x5 work. I've found that the only people who can tell the difference are other large format film shooters or photography curators. Everyone else can't tell them apart. So it's very similar aesthetic wise. And my process hasn't changed at all. I work exactly the same. Work on a tripod, work with natural light. I mentioned making 100 or 200 exposures, and that is only because, say I set up a pose with 4x5 film, I might have made 2 sheets or 4 sheets. And now with digital, because I'll set up a pose and make 20 exposures of the exact same thing and delete, 18 of them. So it's a very similar way of working. But yeah, the medium format digital is pretty amazing in terms of quality. So it's very similar to the large format film.
I have one more question that's interesting. It might be a long answer though, about aging and your own aging. And then, you're confronted the project you chose, and then your own self and your own body, and seeing the aging process, which I think a lot of us clearly are going through all the time. We look our bodies, ourselves, our behavior. How does that affect you, your self-portraits, and how you see yourself in the future as a documentarian of individuals and of yourself?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. I think, in terms of my self-portraits, I'm really interested in making that work over a long period of time. Like I said, the past 6 or 7 months, I've returned to making them kind of intensely. And when I look at the images now versus some of the earlier ones, I definitely see that aging more clearly. And I guess I think of that the most heavily for myself in terms of the family work, especially now having a daughter and making that work. So, yeah, and the work with my mom. I'm definitely thinking about aging, her aging, my aging, how families grow and develop over time. So I would say that that's a pretty significant part of my work as a whole, but most intensely with the family work.
Yeah.
And with the self-portrait work.
So we're getting so much appreciation, your sharing, your inspiration, Jess. I want to wrap it up. I wanted to say a few things. We do record this, everybody that's still listening. So if you want to watch it again, or if you want to tell your friends about it, they can go to the PAC LA website, paclosangeles.com, and find our talks there. And if you've enjoyed this today and you're so inclined, sign up for our mailing list. All of our events are free, or pay what you will. So we'd love to have you and share with you these photographic finds like Jess. I'm really knocked out again. It was so lovely to see the installations. Don't ever hesitate to show installation shots because your audience is always going to be museum people and gallery people, and they like to see how you transition. I didn't know that the prints you make were quite large. So that looks good. The ones behind you, maybe those are just test prints then?
Yeah, so this is my studio, and this is just my print viewing wall. So everything I make a 8x10 test print, and I, sort them by topic and project, and then when I edit a show, I use the little prints. But and I use this as a way to put up new work and spend a couple months looking at it and thinking about it. And
then you go 30 by 40, or are they?
Say that again.
Are they, and then you go 30 by 40 for display for galleries?
Yeah, so my exhibition size are either 18 by 24 or 30 by 40.
Yeah, they're just beautiful. They're just so beautiful.
Thank you. Thank you.
I want to mention to collectors, your work is available through Catherine Edelman in Chicago.
Yes, correct.
So any collectors with us, if you're so inclined, it would be lovely to have some of those portraits on my wall. I'm a portrait collector myself. And
that's my favorite kind.
Sorry?
Oh, I said that's my favorite kind, portrait collector.
Yeah. Well, maybe one day you'll see my collection. It would just be lovely to share with you. But there is so many layers and so many of the individual portraits when you go through the body about aging, the body of work about aging, you just see so many different feelings. You get the sensitivity, the sense of this shared emotion, but also everybody is so different. Mm-hmm. And I really, I credit that to you for your process and the result, of course, and then putting them together in a book or a show, I mean, just is a home run. And I would love to see a show. I saw someone mentioned they saw it in Palm Springs. I'm sorry, I missed that on the West Coast, but I'm sure there will be more exhibitions in the future. And everybody was excited when you mentioned you have something next year. So quite a few people said, oh, good, we can't wait to hear. So hopefully we'll all get to see that.
Oh, great. That sounds good. Yeah. And I should also mention that I'm working on an exhibition of new work from Every Breath We Drew that will open at the St. Louis Art Museum next fall.
Oh, so good.
I'll have an exhibition of To Survive on the Shore up at another museum space, and then new work here in St. Louis. So those will be both on the horizon.
Great. So thank you for that. Are there any other last words?
No, I just want to say thank you to you again for the invitation, and thank you so much to everyone for tuning in and for your questions. I'm sorry if we didn't answer them all, but yeah, just very grateful. So thank you all so much. And
thank you, Jess. It was really wonderful. Everybody, thank you for coming in. Thank you from PAC LA, and stay safe, wash your hands, wear a mask. Okay, stay healthy and stay well, everybody. We're going to say bye-bye now.
Bye.